It's wonderful to see people from all around the world joining us for this, and we do hope you'll share the event once it's online afterwards with some of your colleagues and friends as well. I think we can get started now, and people will probably carry on coming in over time. So welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. I'm really thrilled to present this panel to you. It's a rare lineup of anti-trafficking experts and sex worker experts, all of us here together as activists who want a rights-based future for workers everywhere. I'm Emily Kenway, the impact editor here at Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which is a platform within Open Democracy. BTS was established in 2014 to provide a counterweight to much of the mainstream media coverage on trafficking and forced labor that existed at that time. Our goal was to shape the conversation and educate all relevant stakeholders about the complex nuances of these issues, something we're certainly hoping to do this evening. That means that on our site, you'll find rigorous evidence-based scholarship presented with the clarity and accessibility of journalism. In the past 7 years, we've created numerous resources on sex work and on aspects of trafficking and forced labor. These include ebooks, an online freely available short course on the drivers of global exploitation, interviews, articles, and much, much more. Everything we produce is available entirely for free, but a lot of time and attention goes into it. So please do check us out, sign up to our newsletter, and follow us on Twitter at Beyond Slavery. Now, to the reason that we've gathered here this afternoon, or afternoon for those of us in the UK. Today's live event is part of a new series we've just launched this week and which is running over the coming few weeks, called Time to Get Off the Fence on Sex Workers' Rights. It takes a deep and unflinching look at the anti-trafficking sector's position on sex work regulation and sex workers' rights. Many anti-trafficking organisations and experts portray a public position on sex work that is best described as no position at all. That is the attempt to appear neutral on questions of legality or criminalisation, while still wishing to tackle exploitation within that sector. Today, we're going to explore the question of anti-trafficking neutrality, why it's the preferred non-stance of so many organisations, what this means for workers and survivors, and what we could be doing differently. We definitely want this conversation today to involve you, the audience who's gathered with us, as much as possible. Thank you so much if you sent questions in advance. We're going to try and get through as many of them as we can. If you're joining us on Zoom and you want to ask a question as we go, you can pop it into the chat box. You'll find the icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching this on Facebook, you can pop your questions in the comments there. I'm going to briefly introduce our 4 panelists, and then I'm going to turn to each one for some opening remarks. So we're very, very lucky to be joined today by Jean Bruggeman. Jean is the Executive Director of Freedom Network, the USA's largest coalition working to ensure that trafficked persons have access to justice, safety, and opportunity. Jean previously served as a human trafficking fellow with the Office for Victims of Crime within the US Department of Justice and has over 20 years of victim services experience. We're also joined by Charlotte Lee. Charlotte Lee is a sex worker activist and spokesperson for the English collective of Prostitutes. The ECP is a network of street-based and indoor sex workers campaigning for decriminalization and safety. Their work includes individual casework, public campaigning and advocacy, and they were also a crucial part of the first ever successful private prosecution for rape in England and Wales. Joanna Ewart-James is the Executive Director of Freedom United, which mobilizes a global community to take action against modern slavery. Through their campaigns, events, and other engagements, they equip millions of supporters around the world with awareness, education, and ways to take action. Joanna was previously with Anti-Slavery International, is also chair of the board of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative and a trustee at Labour Behind the Label. And we're joined by Amina du Jean. Amina is a sex worker activist, a writer and influencer. As a university student in London, she served on the board of TAMPEP EU, which is a European Union sponsored network for migrant sex workers, and on the Sex Worker Advocacy Rights Movements Board, otherwise known as SWARM. She's now based in San Francisco and currently works with St. James's Infirmary, America's very first occupational health clinic for sex workers. So as you can see, we've got a pretty stellar lineup to discuss this very important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to start going to panelists. And we're going to go to Amina first. Amina, firstly, thank you so much for joining us. And it would be great if you could tell us in about 3 minutes or so, a bit about how you see the anti-trafficking world interacting with the sex work world.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be on. It's just from my perspective and what I've observed online, at least, a lot of the interactions surrounding the anti-trafficking world, they act as if sex work just does not exist, which I think is a strategic way of kind of promoting their, their agenda, or they don't think that they can promote sex work existing as well as them being like an anti-trafficking service provider or whatever they do. And I think they take a lot of measures so that sex work is seen mainly and only as violence. And they say it's neutrality, but I think sometimes it can be a bit more insidious than that. On an individual level, I think a lot of the people in the trafficking sector, people that I've met, heard speak, they might just not be as educated on these topics, or they really do want the best for people. I think they're just going maybe off of what they've been told or what they've been said or what's been said, but rather on an institutional level, I realize that a lot of these anti-trafficking organizations are pretty much just trying to keep their donors happy. So by saying you support full decriminalization, you would lose a lot of money, which is something that they don't want to do. And then on top of that, I'm not sure if everybody is aware of like the laws in the US about federal grants and getting money, but you can't say that you support full decriminalization, just like you can't say that you support abortion. So I think that that's another factor that would close up the amount of grants and money that they got, even if they do believe it. It just doesn't make sense for them on a financial level to do so. I just want to touch on very briefly, like what I think is a good example of the anti-trafficking sector interacting with sex work. And I think it's maybe something other anti-trafficking organizations should take note of. So with St. James's Infirmary and San Francisco, we do a lot of work with Hope Center. They are based in the Tenderloin, which is San Francisco's most underserved community, and they provide community services. So they are an anti-trafficking organization. They primarily support women and gender nonconforming people that have been victims of sexual exploitation and violence, but they have brought in St. James because we're a team made up of former sex workers and sex workers to interact with the community. So we work as a team. On certain days, we do harm reduction. So we give out, harm reduction supplies. They have mental health services and housing services. And I think that's just a pretty good example of how you can be an anti-trafficking organization, but you can still interact with sex workers or former sex workers positively. Yeah, that's my statement.
Thank you so much, Amina. And I think some really important points that hopefully we can come back to around donor fears and under education, really, people not understanding this. Joanna, it would be great if we could hear from you some introductory remarks about how you see the anti-trafficking world interacting with the sex work world from your perspective in your role as well at Freedom United.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Emily, and great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I beyond, of course, the groups that sit on the fence that you've highlighted, I'm going to go and talk about them later, but I wanted to first of all just set out, for those who aren't familiar, the way that I see the different groups working on anti-trafficking who engage with the world of sex work, how they actually how they're differentiated by their approach. So there's a group who are looking to ensure that full criminalization of sex work is retained. And I guess you could summarize them as people who see criminalization as a solution to what they would say is protecting women from the exploitative sex industry. It kind of aligns with attempts to kind of keep the sex industry out of our town. And it's often presented interchangeably with sex trafficking, which is something that's a big problem that I certainly see in this sector. These are not interchangeable, but that's how I would present that group. And then there's a second group who focus on making sure there's no punishment for engaging in sex work, but engage with a kind of end demand model, which focuses on what they call the Johns. So how we can prosecute, fine or arrest clients, basically. And that's commonly known as people who support the Nordic model. Now, this group is different from the first one that I described, because it does engage with some people in the industry, but it tends to be victims of trafficking who support that very specific model, and excludes victims of trafficking who don't, or sex worker who disagree with this approach. And then the third is for a group that's pushing for, like Freedom United, for decriminalization, who's looking for, you know, an anti-carceral approach and shifting the focus towards building resilience and addressing discrimination and marginalization, the factors that basically lead to exploitation. And of course, that includes sex workers, public health and harm reduction advocates. So those are three broad groups. And then for those sitting on the fence, I mean, their cautiousness in taking a stand indicates to me, you know, a nervousness. I mean, as Amina already said, there's funding restrictions that are set out in USAID funding, that actually you have to sign an anti-prostitution pledge. So you're actually required and by that funding stream, which is one of the bigger sources of funding in this space for work on sex trafficking, to not support anything that would go against that anti-prostitution pledge. And of course, that's the most well-known, but there are other potential funders as well. But I think also this is quite interesting that this is a topic, the anti-trafficking topic is sort of seen as one that cuts above and through politics. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't think it's realistic, but I think there is an interesting argument that, you know, I don't want to enter the fray because this is about an issue where I can work on and find a common ground. And that, I think, is really an important thing to reflect on. You know, are there actually within the organization itself a tension in beliefs between, say, you know, our own sort of anecdotal evidence suggests that actually you often might find more progressive attitudes towards recognizing the importance of sex workers' rights in tackling sex trafficking lower down in the organization, but perhaps at the senior level and board level, you've got more conservative attitudes. I think that's a really important thing to think on, and to really try and create space to have a dialogue internally in organizations, so you can have these discussions and explore, you know, what position the organization should take. And I'd also encourage organizations who are on the fence to really reflect on, you know, is it really realistic or justifiable for sex workers to be outside your realm of work? I mean, most of these organizations are already advocating on workers' rights, the rights to organize, migrant workers, agency, that sort of thing. And these are key elements of preventing labor exploitation. And we're very familiar with the informal sector. So even things like forced begging, legal industries, these are all areas of work where we would look at the rights of individuals. So really, why is it any different for this group of people? Of course, labour rights are for everyone, and it's not just about whether it's in the formal sector or not. I mean, certainly at Freedom United, we're happy to engage in conversations about that. And I know the other thing is to really point out that this is often not like a discrete set of people that we're talking about. I know of quite a lot of cases of people who work in different sectors simultaneously. So they might be working in sex work, but also working in domestic work. They might be migrant workers. So these are people that you may well be engaging with already, but only looking at it from one angle. So I think we have to be really mindful of that, and also think about the stigma that's attached to the industry as well, and to make sure that we're not perpetuating it. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot in there that I should probably use my 3 minutes now, Emily. Back to you.
Thank you so much. I think the point you made about whether hierarchy is creating kind of institutional silences is really interesting, and it's also fantastic to hear someone at the top of a hierarchy suggesting that that might be the case. We're going to move on to Jean. Jean, it would be fantastic if you could give us your thoughts on this same question to kick us off. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to Amina and Joanna for really starting the conversation and laying the groundwork. I agree with everything they've said. I just add on to it. What we're seeing in the US historically is that the sort of end demand movement and the abolitionists have really motivated some private foundations and funders as well, who have really been effective strategically at dominating the messaging in the United States on anti-trafficking and what is sex trafficking and who are the victims and what does that victimization look like. So there's a lot of mis and disinformation that has been perpetuated about the average age of entry into sex work being at 13, and that most trafficking in the United States is child sex trafficking, which none of the data supports. But those are very compelling stories and very compelling framing that has sort of captivated people's attention. On top of which, of course, you have this criminalization narrative that law enforcement have been then painted as the heroes, right? So they're being told that by arresting sex workers and by arresting buyers, they are saving sex workers, and by incarcerating them, they're getting them away from this harmful. They're breaking the cycle, and by and large, people get into law enforcement because they want to be the hero. They want to protect their communities. And so this is a framing of the work that is really enticing and exciting for them, because it tells them exactly what they want to hear. What that has led to in the US is some really ugly, painful, harmful confrontations between survivors of sex trafficking whose only experience in sex work were as a sex trafficking victim, and those who have experienced sex work in a myriad of ways. So that's what, as someone who has not experienced sex work myself, as an outsider to that experience, but as a lawyer who works with trafficking survivors, what I've seen is that it's really pitted survivors in this really terrible way of survivors who say no and are supported by these end-demand abolitionist organizations, funded by them and encouraged to continue telling their story and selling their story, that all sex work is abusive and exploitive, and it is only harmful, and they have to be part of the solution. Versus those who have experienced sex work consensually and at times been exploited, saying, my experience is that there is a range of what happens in this industry and that we have to protect the entire industry, and that this has become confrontational. And I think that's probably the worst thing that has come out of this dynamic, is that people who should be able to work together to find common ground, to find solutions, and to direct us towards the right solutions are being pitted against each other to fight and to destroy some of the best survivor-led programs in the US, and that there have been survivor-led survivor organizations that have fallen apart, that have been destroyed, that have stopped functioning because the rhetoric, especially in the US over the past 2 years, there were a couple of cases of decrim legislation that were brought forward in New York and in DC, in which the abolitionists bust in activists from all over the country to shut down the momentum behind the legislation that had been built by local activists and local sex workers and sex worker right organizations. And then these sort of national organizations who are very committed to abolitionist work came in to undermine that, and were really quite ugly in their critiques, and really got very ugly and painful and harmful. And I think this is sort of the worst of that interaction, and has led to a point where, Freedom Network USA is a human rights-based organization working for the rights of all. We fully support decriminalization, and sex worker rights organizations are fearful of collaborating with us. They are untrusting of us and our allies, because they don't know who to trust, because they have been so attacked. And so I think there's real harm there. My hope in this is the past 4 years of the destruction of human rights, and certainly in the US by the previous administration, and also in other countries. There's a reckoning now. There is a burgeoning support for anti-racism work. And I am hoping that more and more organizations and individuals will start to understand that decriminalization and support of sex worker rights is anti-racist work. If you look at the criminalization patterns, certainly in the United States, is what I can speak to, is certainly racist patterns. And so the only way we can do more than just claim to be anti-racist organizations or working to dismantle racism is to actually support sex workers and decriminalization in order to affect that change, and not just put up statements on our websites.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely clear kind of call to action and allyship at the end, and so many important points made in there, including the enticing idea of rescue that we see as a very big problem in the sector and in law enforcement. Coming to Charlotte, could you tell us a bit about how you see the anti-trafficking world interacting with the sex work world from your perspective?
So in the perspective of the ECP, the interaction has been a lot of misrepresentation, a lot of lies, a lot of fabrication, in the sense that sex work has been conflated with trafficking by an array of people, starting with a lot of prominent feminists, or people who would call themselves feminists, who have come together with evangelical Christians to oppose prostitution on moralistic grounds. And this is a take that has been taken up enthusiastically, as Jean said, by politicians, by the media, by some academics. And it appears to be a deliberate strategy to misrepresent the situation and indulge in a lot of racist stereotyping of migrant sex workers as victims and ignore the voices of sex workers. And it spreads lies about the extent of trafficking, and it fuels sensationalist press coverage and goes against evidence-based policy that supports decrim. And the result is that anti-trafficking law and policy has been used to justify police crackdowns, increase criminalization, and tighten immigration controls. And meanwhile, victims of rape and other violence, including trafficking, often don't get help because of this. And this also represents and negates the lived experiences of sex workers, the majority of whom are mothers trying to provide for themselves and their children. And it also lets the state off the hook for the increase in prostitution and survival sex caused by benefit cuts and by austerity. And it ignores the fact that women do sex work for money first and foremost, to provide for themselves and their children and their families. And it also ignores the fact that women often go into sex work to escape exploitative conditions in other jobs and the degradation of destitution itself, or homelessness or debt. And disregarding sex workers' experiences means, the rise of saturation policing, of criminalization, of deportation, and this is all prioritized over money and support for women. And this has impacted women in our network in a lot of ways. So, for example, Romanian women have spearheaded a campaign against police illegality, racism, and deportations, where trafficking is used as a cover. And we have women in our network who say they speak about how they can't even have a boyfriend because too often it would just be assumed that their boyfriend was their pimp. Or one of the women in our network, an East Asian woman, she was recently arrested as part of a raid, and she was a sex worker herself, but because the English was good, she also helped her friends advertise and make sure that they were safe with clients. And after she was released from the police station, she actually saw via social media that the Met police had said that they had declared that her arrest was a part of an anti-modern slavery operation. And now she is worried that they may charge her for trafficking when all she has done was to help others work safely. So this is a major issue that we have opposed for decades. And internationally, our sister organization, Empower in Thailand, points to the harm caused by anti-trafficking raids. Our other sister organization, the US Prostitutes Collective, points to the imperialist US state policies, which ranks countries according to their anti-trafficking measures, when in practice, it's actually measured by the number of crackdowns on sex workers and in the migration scene. So our sister organization Empower, they actually published this piece of research called Hit and Run on the impact of anti-trafficking policy and practice on sex workers in Thailand. And it showed that it's been used to increase police powers, close borders, mount raid and rescue operations against sex workers, and in general cause great harm. And it contains statistics that show that when the police raid, for every person classified as a victim of trafficking, around 6 to 8 non-trafficked migrant sex workers are arrested, detained, and deported. So, yeah, that is just the ECP's 2 cents on this, and that I hope that I brought the perspective, especially of the specific cases of the women in our network and how the interaction between the anti-trafficking world and the sex work world really has material consequences on the lives of women and migrant women especially.
Yes, thank you so much, Charlotte, for bringing those real cases. And I think it's an excellent example of why ECP's work is so important. In the UK, for people joining us from other countries, there is a major racial stereotyping going on of certain groups, including Eastern European women, like Charlotte mentioned, and ECP is one of the only organizations actually enabling women who are sex working and from those countries to speak out on their own behalf rather than be spoken for. So thank you so much for contributing that. I'm going to ask each panelist a question now, and then we're going to come to audience questions, and I can see some coming in and I already have some as well. Before I ask this question, which is going to be to Jean, because of a couple of the comments I can see, I'm just going to clarify terminology that I'm going to use and some of us have already used. When we say decriminalization or decrim, we mean the removal of laws that are specific to the sex industry. Therefore, the sex industry would come under the same labor laws, the same anti-trafficking laws as everything else. This is different to legalization, or what we could call it regulationism, which is what they have, for example, in Germany, where there are a very specific regime of laws and regulations applied to the sex industry that make it different to other labor sectors and are widely regarded as problematic by sex worker activists. And there's lots of reading on the internet and on Beyond Trafficking and Slavery about that. So, Jean, because you have this position of having spent many years working in support services for survivors and running Freedom Network, it would be really great to hear from you about how you see anti-trafficking organisations' failure to take a pro-decriminalisation stance as affecting support services for survivors.
Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated, obviously, as with all of these issues. You know, in the United States, I will say, there is this sort of context in which direct service providers, often nonprofits, right? So because our government sort of fails to provide any kind of safety net for anything, and instead privatizes it all, most of that work is done by nonprofits, by non-governmental organizations in the United States. And there is this sort of belief among many that direct service providers and nonprofits should not be engaged in policy work and advocacy. There is a legal restriction. We cannot get involved in supporting specific political candidates, but actually nonprofits can and should be involved in policy and advocacy work. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. So first of all, direct service providers feel like they're not allowed to get engaged in policy, and so often see, you know, this as a policy issue that is sort of beyond their scope. Additionally, there is a tension between, sort of given all we've talked about how the context exists right now, and there is such strength in this anti-sex work narrative right now. Direct service providers, their primary goal is to assist the individual in front of them. And I would say, as a lawyer, specifically, my job in representing one individual ethically is to respond to their needs primarily, to first serve them and what they need and what is best to them as an individual before addressing sort of the greater good. In the US, where our law, especially for immigrants, requires that immigrant trafficking survivors report to law enforcement, and where we want that experience to be as not the least amount of harm possible, right? It's always traumatic, but we want to reduce the amount of trauma that a survivor experiences in reporting their experience to law enforcement, leads to a pressure for service providers to develop a good rapport with their local law enforcement agencies so that they can assist survivors in reporting to law enforcement the trafficking they've experienced, especially for, again, as I said, immigrants are required to do so in order to access immigration protection. So there is this pressure for service providers to not antagonize, to not cause tension within networks that are often arranged or supported by abolitionist organizations and by law enforcement that is already predisposed to be a savior and to use a savior mentality. So what that ends up doing is creating a situation in which sex trafficking survivors often do not see themselves as trafficking victims, or do not believe that they will be served by these organizations, right? So I think that in trying to provide the best services possible to the person in front of them, in the long term, we're making the problem worse, right? Keeping sex work underground where it's dangerous, difficult, and harmful, and people are unable to access the services and support that they need. And then sort of pushing sex workers away and telling them, we're not here for you, we do not relate to you, we are not your allies. And so people are even more specifically fearful of engaging with those agencies because they do not see them as a safe place to go for services. So again, both sort of policy-wise, and then because of this individual experience, we're creating a situation in which many people are going without the services and support that they need.
Thank you so much. I really hoped you'd speak about that. And I think it's a really compelling reason to think about decriminalization, which is serving the best interests of the people that apparently all sides care about, you know? Amina, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. And I'd love to hear from you about if anti-trafficking organisations got off the fence and started supporting sex workers' rights, what would you like their engagement with the sex industry to look like?
Hi, so I'm going to speak on some recent stuff that we've been dealing with in California. So as some of you might know, a few people at St. James, as well as the ACLU, Scott Wiener in San Francisco, are trying to pass SB 357, which would effectively end the Walking While Trans bill, or the bill that, or the law that attacks people who are working on the street, or profiles them for doing sex work. And so far, the co-sponsors of this are Positive Women's Network, which is an HIV network for women, St. James, where I work, SWAP LA, Trans Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, Legal, all of these with the ACLU. So these are the people who co-sponsored it. And you would think that anti-trafficking organizations would be on board with this, because if you look at the statistics, it's roughly 75% of the people in Los Angeles who are arrested under this penal code are Black and Latina women, some trans, who are living in, not the best conditions. Some of them may be, victims of exploitation. So you would think that anti-trafficking organizations would be on board with this. However, the main opposition to this are anti-trafficking organizations, which is incredibly strange. I think it goes to show that a lot of the anti-trafficking sectors around the world, but especially in the US, simply rely on emotions, because it's a lot easier to get money that way than facts. Because if you go by the facts, it would show that, something like the example of SB 357 would help people who may be possibly exploited. So I think looking at that, I would want anti-trafficking organizations to just support facts over, what their party line is, I guess, so to say. Something I wanted to end this on is that they also need to build good relations with migrant groups. A lot of anti-trafficking groups have a very white saviorism sort of complex with the way that they approach people. And by white, I don't mean specifically like white people, but they can be from all backgrounds, but just this mindset that they are there to save the migrant rather than seeing them as somebody they can work with. Even if the migrant is someone who has experienced exploitation, just on a human level, to recognize their autonomy, I think is incredibly important. San Francisco is a sanctuary city, which means that in practice, they say that they don't really deport that many people. However, migrants here are still incredibly afraid. We also don't really prosecute that many sex workers here for just selling sex. Still, people are afraid. St. James, we've done outreach to massage parlors and places where migrant sex workers primarily work. And we're a well-known, sex workers' rights group or, clinic in the city, and they're still afraid of us. We have to respect that. We have to respect their boundaries, maybe try to go back in a few months, but we have to respect their autonomy. So I think getting off the fence and actually supporting sex workers' rights is being in favor of bills that would help people who may sell sex willingly or may be exploited to sell sex. It would be getting off the fence and actually seeing yourself as an equal to someone who may be a migrant and making the effort to actually talk and communicate with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amina. And yeah, I find that an incredibly powerful point, that this idea we have of someone is a migrant, a sex worker, a trafficking survivor. Well, actually, they're a human with agency, autonomy, intelligence, ambition, everything that all of us have. And that can really get lost a lot of the time. I'm going to come to Charlotte in a moment, but I wanted to mention that Erin Kilbride put an interesting report in the chat that I had a look at earlier and is worth having a look at, from Frontline Defenders, which is about sex worker human rights defenders and the attacks that they experience, and very relevant to things we're talking about. So Charlotte, when anti-trafficking organisations take a neutral stance on sex workers' rights and therefore allow people promoting criminalisation to take control of the issue, what does that mean for migrant sex workers how does that harm migrant sex workers? And what's your kind of views on that?
So I just would like to start off with the part of the question when it comes to letting people who are pro-criminalization, take control of the narrative. The Nordic model is an imminent threat in the UK, and I mean for a good reason, because as I said before, all these like supposedly feminist politicians have been riding the wave of a very marketable claim that, oh, we would like to help people who are sexually exploited, who are victims of trafficking, and have been recent proposals to overhaul the prostitution laws in the UK to define all sex work as commercial sexual exploitation and criminalize what they would call the facilitation of sex work, which is an incredibly vague term that can be used to go after anyone even tangentially related to the industry. And it makes it virtually impossible for women to work without the threat of arrest. And with regards to your question about what it means for migrant sex workers, I'm speaking on behalf of the ECP, but also of women in our network. And for us, this is not a matter of debate. This is our lives and this is our families' lives. And for organizations to sit on the fence when we are being attacked and criminalized, it means that, sexism, racism, violence, stigma, distress, deportation, poverty, and exploitation, they win the day. And that some anti-trafficking organizations may tell themselves that they're doing good, but they can only get away with that by blocking their ears to the harms that are caused by their actions a lot of the times. And it means that we spend our time fighting proposals to further criminalize sex work. It means that women in our network are evicted, criminalized, and harmed. It means that police and immigration powers increase, and the opposition to them is quite muted because authorities can claim the cover of trafficking and saving victims. And this is why we are thankful for organizations like, for example, Freedom United, that publicly stand for decrim. And this is not an easy feat. I've spoken at the Freedom United webinar a few months back, and I've seen some of the hostility that these organizations receive because of the fact that they come out as pro-decrim. But coming out for decrim is a statement recognizing that the issues of anti-trafficking and sex work, they're inextricably linked. And it's in opposition to how anti-trafficking rhetoric has essentially been weaponized against sex workers to deprive us of money, safety, and rights.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I think your points, it's kind of comes down to, is this justifiable as a position? Because this is about real people's lives and real harm. And we, one of the pieces we've had out so far from this series by anti-trafficking expert Clara Skrivanko on our website is very clear on that actually there comes a point where, you need to use your courage and take a stance. It's very appropriate, therefore, to go to Joanna, who is the executive director of a major NGO that has taken a stance, and certainly in the UK, that has been a really big deal for all of us who would like to see decrim, and we're all hugely grateful. Joanna, do you think that getting off the fence and becoming publicly pro-decrim has implications for your strategy as an anti-trafficking organisation? And if so, what are they?
Thanks, Emily. And thanks very much for your support, Charlotte. We've definitely found the ECP and also Empower Thailand really helpful for educating us as well in the beginning. And I mean, we've always been concerned about trafficking in the sex industry, but we hadn't done much work on it until we needed to take a stand that make it clear, as we've already said, but I'll say it again, that not all sex work is a result of trafficking. And we wanted to make it absolutely clear that clamping down on sex workers' rights does nothing for building resilience to trafficking in the sex industry. So what does it mean for our strategy? Well, our strategy is informed by partners, as I just mentioned, and stakeholders here. And that includes sex workers who, as we've already heard, have been pretty excluded from anti-trafficking efforts and policy making. So, but the insight that we've had from these new partnerships and conversations has helped us to also be an anti-trafficking organisation who can say when a proposed so-called anti-trafficking piece of legislation is actually harmful, and to be honest, it's probably would be accurately described as being mislabeled anti-trafficking. Really, these are anti-sex work initiatives that are being, as we already heard, that the anti-trafficking narrative is being weaponized against sex work. And I think that's been a really important job. And certainly, as Jean said, there's a lot of trust building that we've had to do to build those relationships. But it's also so important as well from an allyship point of view that we aren't, it's not just sex worker organizations who are having to say, no, this is not a helpful initiative. You're calling it anti-trafficking initiative, but it's not. So to have an anti-trafficking organization saying that is about being an effective ally for getting a better framework for actually tackling exploitation. This isn't really that different from our strategy in general. In any other sector like domestic work, the sectors where we know that there's vulnerability to exploitation, like domestic work, the fishing industry or manufacturing, we'll always listen to people with lived experience, be that good or bad. We'll listen to people who are survivors of trafficking, and also we'll listen to other workers who are able to organise and negotiate conditions that actually prevented them from being trafficked or exploited. And that's how we understand the best way to build resilience in different sectors. So that doesn't change greatly, but of course, in this sector has it enabled us to really speak out in a way that, as you've mentioned, we haven't seen many anti-trafficking organisations do. And that allyship is so valuable both ways. And so there's a lot, of course, the anti-trafficking sector can learn from sex workers, as well as harm reduction and anti-carceral approaches used by public health advocates. And the sex workers organisations and public health work organisations and HIV prevention NGOs have worked together for a long time. That's not entirely new. So that's a model that we can really look to replicate as well as anti-trafficking organisations. We're not taking a moral agenda or a value judgment. Like Jean said, this is basically a simple human rights approach. That's all it is. So I hope, that this conversation as well will help others who are listening in to see how we can move forward and, move away as well from this tendency to focus on law enforcement crackdowns and surveillance. And ultimately, what's clear, like it is in so many parts of the anti-trafficking sector, is that we have to tackle these underlying causes of these marginalizations, these targeting and discrimination that is really constructing vulnerabilities to exploitation. And that's the way we're going to actually tackle the issue in a way that's going to be sustainable and meaningful.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think what you said about this is about getting a better framework for tackling exploitation is really something that anyone who's watching this event could think about in terms of anti-trafficking strategies, because we heard from Charlotte, for example, of a case where a woman is being potentially accused of being a trafficker for doing something that any of us might do in our jobs, helping out colleagues essentially, because you have a skill that they don't have. And I think we are all aware who work on this that the kind of lists of indicators that are used by anti-trafficking organisations to identify victims are actually complete failures to understand how the sex industry actually operates, how you might be sharing a phone line with a friend and this kind of thing. So it's actually incredibly inefficient from a law enforcement perspective, let alone anything else. There's a really great briefing by the ICRSE as well on the kinds of projects that you can do if you open the door to actually working with sex workers properly that help you identify victims of trafficking. So yeah, it's an enabling strategy really. And I loved your point about this is basically the same as every other sector. And I think that's probably the kind of really clarion call in there that we need to be thinking about. So we've got a few minutes now for audience questions. I have some that were sent in advance. And I'd really like to ask the first question to you, Charlotte. It comes in from someone called Anna, and Anna says, I always struggle to tell when an anti-trafficking organisation is anti-sex work. What are the telltale signs that they are? And I thought this might be a great one for you to answer from an ECP perspective, because I know ECP has some views on this.
Well, firstly, if they support the Nordic model, then it's quite clear that they are anti-sex work. And if you look through their sites and what they stand for, it's often very clear, because when they think that it's all kind of a blanket, the blanket statement that all sex workers are exploited, that I don't know. I think it's very easy to tell, but maybe it's because it's just an occupational hazard by now. But I think the Nordic model is one, but there's of course many prominent politicians, especially in the UK, that are very suave, curves and swaths. Yeah.
Thanks. For people who aren't familiar, that means sex worker, exclusionary, radical feminist. And yeah, I personally think conflating sex work and trafficking would be a one, and also anything about rescuing, the same complex coming through in little places. So yeah, Amina, I'd like to ask you this question, and it's partly because the Nordic model's been being referred to during this, and it's kind of something we should probably touch upon. Someone called Christos has asked, what do you think about the Swedish model, which is another name for the Nordic model, of combating trafficking? And just before we go to, just make it clear that this model criminalizes the clients of sex workers. Allegedly, it does not criminalize sex workers themselves. It's not actually a law that's targeted at tackling trafficking, it's targeted at tackling the sex industry. So what do you think about the Swedish model, the Nordic model, whatever we want to call it, Amina?
So actually I did go to Sweden for the 20th anniversary of the implementation of the Nordic model before the world went crazy in 2019. And we did a conference there, and it was really moving to hear these experiences people have had under the Nordic model, because I don't think the Swedish government really releases any information about how it's going there. Obviously, it's been implemented all around Europe now, and Canada, I think in Israel now. And my understanding of it is that it's just merely a tool to get rid of migrants that people see as undesirable. For what I've read, that this, legislation came about in Sweden when they started having influx of Eastern European and Nigerian sex workers working the streets there. So from what I've heard and what I've read, I don't really see them helping anybody that's trafficked. It's just a way to get people out that they don't like. And it's, I guess it has a veil of progressivism. Nobody's gonna object helping women or what they think is helping trafficking victims. So it's going to be hard to find anybody that objects it. And yeah, I think it's very unfortunate that it's spread throughout Europe and Canada. I think it's very patronizing. I think it just takes agency away from people who might need to sell sex. I don't think it's the government's place to have that legislation there. It's been a disaster, really.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I think it's very telling from what you're telling us. There's a lot of great materials out there about why this model is so harmful, and there are some articles on BTS as well. We're going to need to wrap up in a minute, but Joanna and Jean, I actually want to come to you with the same question, as you are executive directors of major anti-trafficking organizations. An anonymous attendee has asked if you could say something about your experience speaking with funders about these issues and taking a pro-decrim stance, and I'm sure that's going to be on a lot of people's minds. If we could just go first to Jean and then Joanna, and I'm going to ask you to keep it as brief as possible.
Sure. It's a challenge, I will say. There are certain funders that we are not qualified for funding for because they specifically put in their RFPs that you have to take a end demand or abolitionist stance. And so that's funding that's not available to us. There are, however, some funders, private funders who have understood this position, who support this position, who are working with us. And we've been working to try to expand that pool and educate funders. But there's, I'm not going to lie, it's tough. It's a lot easier to find funders who support the abolitionist movement than those who support us. So it's a struggle. I will point out, because it has come up in the chat and in a question, that there certainly is. So the US does require this prostitution pledge on its trafficking funding, but it actually does not bar you from taking a decriminalization stance. So Freedom Network USA has funding from the US government, and that has not been a problem for us.
Thank you very much. Joanna?
So I think Freedom United does have one big organisational advantage over many of our peers, in that we have independent sources of funding that neither explicitly nor implicitly influence our work, which, you know, I'm very grateful for. And that does allow us to chart an independent path when it comes to tackling human trafficking. And I know that, you know, that's a pretty rare freedom, and the human rights movement in general is not awash with funding. And I'm sure that funding preferences and requirements are definitely a significant factor, as Jean just outlined. You know, but I think it's really important to try not to self-censor yourself about, you know, how you tackle an issue, and really keep a focus on what it is that you're trying to achieve in the work that you're doing, and keep very much a focus on that, with the idea that you can actually educate and bring on even funders as well as wider society, which is of course what we need to do on this topic. But I feel like things have changed. I think, as we've just heard just during the course of the conversation, I think there's just a growing awareness about some of these underpinning factors, especially on racism. And I think that as we'll see in response to that, much more appetite to be supporting these progressive voices. So I think there's space is going to grow for it. But I think also, don't be afraid to speak out, as Jean said. You know, there is an anti-prostitution pledge, but, you know, obviously there's also First Amendment rights. So, you know, we should definitely exercise them and say what we believe is important.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, and sometimes with some funders where in countries where that doesn't apply, there is a question to be asked, I think, about how much funders won't like it if we do this thing is actually being used to avoid doing that thing. It is time for us to draw to a close. I'd just like to say something that really stands out to me from a lot of what people have been saying is the need for education of anti-trafficking organisations, staff within them, of funders of those organisations, because clearly there's a lot that isn't being understood, isn't being heard, isn't being respected about what would be best for the industry and for exploitation within that industry as well. So lots more work to do, but thank you so much to each of our four amazing panelists. I think this has been a really rare collection of people and expertise, and it's just been an absolute privilege. It takes bravery to speak about this topic, and we're really grateful for your time and for your courage. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. There will be a replay available online afterwards. Please share it with colleagues and contacts in the anti-trafficking field. Get conversations started, have a lunchtime discussion, and help make progress towards a rights-based future. I also should tell you that openDemocracy hosts a weekly debate. You can check out their website and social media for details. There's a live discussions tab there. And they also rely on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism and debate like this, please support openDemocracy. You can go to their donate page on the website. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been genuinely fantastic, and wishing you all a great rest of your days.